All right, can everybody hear me in the room? Hello, okay, great. I hope our online audience can also hear us. But if you don't, or if you have any trouble hearing us during the presentation, please just use the Q&A box in Zoom to send us a little message and alert us if there's any problems with sound. We'll be speaking into the mics here today so that our online audience can also pick up the sound because we're doing the program in a hybrid fashion. So hello and welcome to our session, Rutgers' Experience in Studying Slavery and the Development of the Scarlet and Black Project. My name is Jesse Bayker, and I work at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. And there I serve as the research project manager and digital archivist for the Scarlet and Black Project. So I'm going to moderate our roundtable today. And we will have a more of an informal discussion format because we want to leave time for plenty of time for questions from our audience in the room as well as online. So today joining me on the panel is Dr. Miya Carey, at the end, Assistant Professor of History at Binghamton University. Next we have Dr. Beatrice Adams, Assistant Professor of African American History at the College of Wooster, and Dr. Tracy Johnson, who is now the Scarlet and Black Postdoctoral Fellow at Rutgers University. So I'm going to start us off today by giving you a little bit of a background about the Scarlet and Black Project, what it is, how it came about, and then we'll have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves and tell you about their connection to the project. And then I have some questions for our panelists today that we'll launch into, and we'll also leave time for audience Q&A. So Rutgers today is the State University of New Jersey. We have over 66,000 students throughout the state, and we have campuses in 3 cities in different parts of New Jersey. But the school really started out as a small college called Queens College in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The school was first chartered in 1766 by a group of Dutch Reformed ministers who wanted to establish a college for their sons and for the elites, the Dutch elites of North America. And these were people who primarily were settling in New Jersey and New York region. So it's the 8th oldest college in the country. So since we were founded in 1766, back in 2016, we were coming up on our 250th anniversary. And this was an important turning point for the college in terms of thinking about our history and the way that we tell our story. So I'm going to go to the slides now. So during the 250th anniversary, there were many celebrations on campus around the theme of revolutionary Rutgers. And there was a lot of talk about our storied revolutionary heritage and our Scarlet pride. Scarlet is, of course, the school color of Rutgers. So during this moment of celebration, a group of students, undergraduate students, who were primarily affiliated with the Black Lives Matter movement on campus, approached the administration with this question: well, we're talking about this revolutionary heritage and how proud we should be to be one of the oldest schools in the country, but when you're talking about that era, you're talking about the era of slavery. You're talking about the era of dispossessing Native Americans of their land. So what is Rutgers' connection to that history? And are we going to talk about that now that we're celebrating our history? And the students approached then Chancellor Richard Edwards of Rutgers, New Brunswick. And the chancellor said, well, you know, we don't actually know exactly what is our history, what is Rutgers' connection to African-American history in that period in time, and we really need to look into it. So from that came a research project that came to be known as the Scarlet and Black Project. And it really represented an effort by the institution to take our Scarlet pride and see what happens when we add Black history into that story. How does that change the narrative of Rutgers? So this research project, and again, I'll go to a slide here. This research project was co-directed by Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Marisa Fuentes. who are historians of African American history at Rutgers. And they said, we have at Rutgers, we're lucky to have one of the best PhD programs in African American history. So we should leverage that to do this research. So the way that the research project worked is we got funding for PhD students. So we had a group of researchers, between 12 and 15 researchers at a time, who went into the archives to really dig up this history. So all of the people that you see on the panel today, we all received our PhDs in history from Rutgers, and we all initially started our involvement with the project when we were PhD students, and we were doing this research for the project then. So out of our initial work came this book that's on the slide here, the Scarlet and Black Project, Volume 1, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History. And we published the book in 2016, and there were also some recommendations then that came out of the book. The book really talked about the early history of Rutgers, the involvement of the officers and trustees in slavery and in the slave trade, in the money that was funding Rutgers, and how it was, some of that money was coming from people who enriched themselves through the slave trade. And the book also addressed questions like the intellectual life on campus and some of the racial ideology that was being taught in the classrooms at Rutgers, as well as the relationship between Rutgers and the surrounding Black community in New Brunswick. So one of the recommendations that came out of presenting that book and that report was to reshape some of the landscape on campus, and that's on the next slide. You'll see one of the historical markers that we've installed on campus that is actually, this marker is honoring an enslaved man that helped to build the oldest university that's on campus. And we named a street leading up to this building in his honor. His name was Will. So this is Will's Way now. So we'll get more into talking about the historical markers and some of the building names on campus in our discussion today. Another thing that came out of this initial push was the idea that we really needed to not stop in the era of slavery when we're talking about African American history at Rutgers. We needed to trace that history, both the history of anti-Blackness and of racist exclusion, and also the history of students and faculty on campus pushing against that in the present day. So we needed to trace that to the present time. So we followed up with Scarlet and Black Volume 2, this book, Constructing Race and Gender, Rutgers, 1865 to 1935. So that was published in 2020. And then Scarlet and Black Volume 3, Making Black Lives Matter at Rutgers, 1945 to 2020. And that third book just came out this spring. So over the past 5 years, we have published these 3 books, as well as you'll see on the next slide here, established a digital archive at scarletandblack.org. So this is the project that I'm responsible for. It's one of the hats that I wear at the project. At the Scarlet and Black Project is running our digital archive, where we are digitizing and making accessible primary sources from our research, primary sources that connect Rutgers to the African American history in New Jersey. And we're making those accessible as a tool for researchers and educators in New Jersey. So I will wrap up my introductory remarks here, and I just want to leave off by saying that now that we've kind of turned the corner on finishing the last of the 3 books, we are moving the Scarlet and Black Project into a new institute on campus that's called the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. This is a brand new institute that's being established, and Scarlet and Black will continue its life there, going into some new directions with the idea of continuing Rutgers' commitment to studying anti-Blackness and to studying the way that Black New Jerseyans have pushed back against anti-Blackness, and really taking this history to a broader scale besides just thinking about Rutgers, but really thinking about the history of New Jersey and what we as the state university owe to the students of New Jersey, both at the college and K through 12 level. So that's some of the work that we'll be continuing to do at the Institute now under the leadership of Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. So I will now hand it off to Dr. Miya Carey.
Good morning. Hopefully you all can hear me. My name is Dr. Miya Carey. I am an assistant professor at Binghamton University in Binghamton, New York. And as Dr. Bayker stated, my relationship with Scarlet and Black began as a graduate student. I was a researcher for volume 1, where I co-authored a piece with my co-panelist here, Dr. Adams, looking at the wills of the trustees of Queens College and trying to locate enslaved experiences within those wills. I continued researching for the second volume, which brought us into the 20th century, and I had the opportunity to talk about Douglass College, which was the women's college that is now merged with Rutgers, but it started off as a women's college. And then I became the postdoc for volume 3, where I managed the research that our graduate student researchers were working on for volume 3. And I had the opportunity to co-edit volume 3 along with Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Marisa Fuentes. So my involvement with the project has been quite long and extensive. But yeah, I'm happy to, if we have time in the Q&A, talk more about what we wrote about, but I guess I can pass it on to the next person.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. This is a new setup for me. My name is Beatrice Jay Adams, and I'm assistant professor of African American history at the College of Wooster. My connection to the project also started as a grad student, but I would say more specifically, it started with the student protest on campus. I remember coming into class one day and hearing the undergrads talk about, there are these revolutionary signs up, like, what's revolutionary about Rutgers? And asking myself that question, right? There's a colonial past, the university has connections to the Revolutionary War, but what is truly revolutionary about the way in which we tell the history and the way in which the campus has developed were questions that I took away even before the kind of formal committee was established. So I was first in line to wave my hand and say that I wanted to be one of the researchers for the project. And I've always been deeply interested in the history of the spaces in which I live. Is one way I feel like I can kind of cultivate a home in a place. So that was true for this project as well. As far as my contribution to the project, like Dr. Carey said, for the first volume, we wrote about kind of the wheels and the slaving culture that we could see through those documents related to kind of the early leaders and founders of Rutgers University. For the next volume, I wrote about early African-American graduates of Rutgers, and maybe like a true millennial, I went to the archive, I got Dick McCormick's notes, and I started typing to Google Drive all the names of early African-American graduates, and I started Googling them. And I quickly discovered that in addition to the more famous names or the names I'm familiar with, like Paul Robeson and James Carr, all these men are doing these incredible things I had not heard of. They're ambassadors, they're school principals, they're teachers. And I quickly began to thought about this kind of connection between what it means to be a Rutgers man and what it means to be a race man. And that's what the article explores. And last, but certainly not least, I wrote about the student revolution on the Rutgers campus, but shifting from thinking a lot about New Brunswick to writing about Rutgers and Newark. So the Conklin Hall takeover and how the students were deeply in touch with and connected to the larger Black Power movement happening in Newark at the time. So those have been my contributions. I've also worked on the digital archive and done some community-based research, which I'd love to talk more about during the Q&A.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Johnson. I'm currently the Scarlet and Black Postdoctoral Associate, but I have worked on the Scarlet and Black Project with my colleagues here since the beginning. So it's been really great to see it grow and be involved with the project in different arenas throughout campus and New Brunswick as well. That's what I love a lot about this project, is that the community members of New Brunswick are really interested in learning about the history of the college, as well as the history of enslavement and dispossession in New Brunswick more broadly. So one of the projects that I was involved in addition to Scarlet and Black, was a project started by the Zimmerly Art Museum, which is the campus museum. And it was inspired by Scarlet and Black. And one of the main goals was to create reinterpretive text for some of the artworks that were in the collections of the Zimmerly Museum, and really focus on the subjects of the paintings, relationship to slavery and dispossession. So that project also had graduate student researchers, including myself, but it also included undergrads, which I think was a great thing, because it really put the students in the archives and doing this primary research about their school. And I think it's something that other universities could do really easily. So I have a few slides that is explaining my research findings from that project, just because I think it would be a good thing to kind of mirror at other universities. So this is is this a blank slide, or can I see? Is this the, okay. So this is the portrait of Abraham Pulmus. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I still don't know after 2 years, but he was a graduate of Rutgers. He graduated in 1831, and then he attended the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. He eventually became a pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church in Newark, New Jersey. And much like Jesse explained earlier, there was a stronghold of really prominent Dutch families, and his family was one of them. They had been in New York and New Jersey for over 200 years. So when I did my research, I found that Abraham himself did not own any enslaved people, but he grew up around them. So there is, some documents that I found while researching. The one on the right is a lot more concrete, where it says it's likely that Abraham Pulmus's 6 slaves worked with him in his tannery. The only confusing thing about this is that Abraham, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather were all named Abraham. So this isn't the Abraham from the photo, or from the portrait. But another interesting note that I found was in the New York Times from 1861, where they tell a story about an enslaved man escaping from Virginia to New York, and his name was John Pulmus, or Pulhamus, but that wasn't even really a common name back then. So that led me to believe maybe he had ties to that family, which is why he went all the way to New York City to escape. Perhaps he had family members still there. And then I found the record of slave manumissions in New York, and I see that an Abraham Pulmus, I think is either his father or grandfather, manumitted Saul and William Jackson. So when I wrote the reinterpretive text, I made sure to talk about his family's ties to enslavement, and that they were able to become so prominent because of those ties. Another painting that I looked at was called The Homestead of William Warner. William Warner was not a Rutgers graduate. He actually was born in 1627 in England, but he was the first European to settle in what is now known as West Philadelphia. He came in the mid-1670s and settled officially, I guess, in 1677, which was actually 5 years before William Penn founded Philadelphia. And through my research, I found that it was said that he negotiated with the Lenape people to purchase 1,500 acres of land. I was not able to verify that, but I think the important thing is to recognize that the wealth that William Warner and his descendants were able to accrue over, the centuries was in part due to this land that had been lived on for hundreds and hundreds of years before by the Lenape people. And that is something that we focused on in the Scarlet and Black Project and different projects throughout Rutgers. So that was one of the things that I did outside of Scarlet and Black.
All right, thank you everybody for introducing yourselves. So I have a couple of questions for our panelists. So first of all, the Scarlet and Black Project, there has always been this research endeavor led by historians, but we really had to build relationships with other institutions, both and groups, both on campus and off campus, to succeed in our work. As Dr. Johnson just said, one of the institutions was the Emory Museum, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what were those relationships, who else did you have to work with in order to bring this project to fruition?
So I can speak to the on-campus relationships that we cultivated over the course of this project. And two specifically come to mind. So Rutgers has what's called the Rutgers Oral History Archive. This is really rich collection of oral histories done of alumni, people involved in the community, veterans that have a tie to Rutgers. So what we did was, once we got to volume 3, which is the post-World War II period through the present, we're dealing with subjects that are still living. So the archive actually approached us and asked if we were going to, be interviewing people. We thought this would be a really fruitful partnership because part of the methods that our graduate students used was, interviewing alumni. So what the archive did for us is they actually provided a training for graduate students. So those who weren't trained in the method of, interviewing living subjects, they provided a workshop for us. Some of them even kind of worked with our graduate students as they completed these interviews. But I think the most important part of this partnership was that the histories that our students created now live on the digital archive, the Rutgers Oral History Archive. So again, they're part of this really vast, really rich archive. And with this project, one thing that we have always been mindful of is the legacy and the footprint that the project leaves after the research phase is over, after the publication is over. We don't want the project to disappear. So what's one way that we can leave our legacy? I believe that by having these histories as part of the ROHA is one way that we see the footprint of this project. And the archive is open not just to Rutgers affiliates, but even if you're just a community member, you can also access this website. We also had to partner with another institution on campus. So as I stated in the introduction, for volume 2, I did research on New Jersey College for Women, which became Douglas College, which is now a part of Rutgers University. So what we did was we had to contact the Alumni Association, who again had this really rich treasure trove of alumni records. So they have files of almost every student that matriculated through the college. So it became very important for us to access these sources. So anyone that has dealt with kind of these alumni institutions, that you have to build a sense of trust. because obviously they're very protective of their alumni, and they also want to make sure that we're, writing in a certain way. So it's like you're kind of trying to, juggle what we want to write with kind of what their expectations of what the project should be. So we're really intentional in trying to build relationships and trust with the Alumni Association. And that meant just being honest with them and telling them what the project was about, what we envisioned, what we would talk about regarding Douglas and the alumni. And thankfully they were receptive. But I bring this up because, again, it's important to build that trust, and it's not going to be immediate. And you may not, have that immediate reception from not just institutions on campus, but especially off of campus as well. But we were able to nurture this partnership over volume 2 and volume 3. And they gave us, basically complete access to all of their records, but they also put us in touch with alumni that were still living, and we got to talk to them and interact with them. And that did so much to enrich what we wrote about their experiences on campus being Black women. So just to kind of wrap things up, again, we're very fortunate in that we had institutional support for all 3 volumes. And I think one of the ways that we have maintained that support was by showing that multiple entities on campus have a stake in the project. And building these relationships on campus have been really critical to us maintaining this support.
Okay. One way I've kind of leveraged the project to make community relationships is when you're thinking about writing about the African-American experience, one of the key institutions you're gonna think about is the Black church. And the earliest African-American church in New Brunswick actually has this kind of rich, vast, unique, wonderful history room where they have ledgers that go back from the founding of the church that talk about key events, the finances, all the way through programs of Women's Day and of Men's Day and Mother's Day in the 2000s. So as researchers for the project, we had to build trust, right, with this church, that we're going to respect your documents, that we can come into your history room and do this work and write a history that speaks to your values, to your energies. And then after the writing was done, there was this question about digitization. So if some of the researchers could come back to the history room and give something back to the church in a way, and digitize some of their more precious records, right? And also talk to them about how to use acid-free boxes and how best to maintain some of the more delicate documents. That project was cut short by COVID, but I think, of course, right, COVID. But I think building those types of community relationships is one of the key cornerstones of the project. In addition to that, having done oral histories with some of the stakeholders for the history about the takeover in Newark, I actually became involved with another community history project, Rise of Newark, which explores the history of the Black Power movement in Newark, and eventually in part led to a new effort put on by the mayor to have a museum dedicated both to the rebellion and also to how do we heal from the trauma of urban Black life in some ways, right? So not only have I been able to do some community-based research through the project, the relationships that I've built participating in community-based research as a researcher for the project has continued to allow me to make new connections and build networks in Newark and New Jersey around public history work.
Okay, I want to give us a time check that it is now 10:30, so that means that we have about 15 more minutes. That although I have more questions for our panelists, I would like to prioritize questions coming in from our audience. So we're going to take one of these microphones now and put it up so that if you're in the audience and you have a question, I'm going to invite you to step up, ask a question. But first, we actually already have a few questions coming in from our online audience, so we'll go to that. And then we'll take some questions. If you have a question, just step up. We have a pretty straightforward question, so I'll go to that first from Rachel Breckus in our online audience. And Rachel asks, can we talk about how and from whom the funding for this project was supplied? Was it solely straight from the top after the conversation with the students? And she says, I am here salivating over the level of funding that covers multiple grad students' work. So the answer is pretty straightforward. Yes, all the funding for this project came from our administration. And I think that it's really important to emphasize here that this is what made the project successful, was that we definitely had a leadership from the top. We had an investment from the top. And when the students approached the Chancellor of New Brunswick, he decided this is something that's important, that needs to be done. And we're going to take a stand that Rutgers is an institution that cares about our own history and is not afraid to look at our history, because it's not looking at our history is not going to weaken us. It will only make us stronger. So this is an investment in the strength of Rutgers as an institution going forward, and the Chancellor provided the funds for this work. Then we'll have some questions here. I'll roll two questions together from Dr. Alexandria Russell and Dr. Walter Rucker. They both thank us for the panel, so thank them. So Dr. Russell asks, can you talk more about the significance of graduate student research for this work, and how did this project impact your experience as a graduate student? And Dr. Rucker asks also about the involvement of undergraduate students in this work, and how were the undergraduates for that? So we can. Okay. So let's tackle some of these questions about graduate student and undergraduate student research. Anybody who wants to jump in on that?
So as a graduate student, I'm a 20th century historian. So for volume one, it really challenged me, and it really stretched me. But it was such a really good learning experience. And now that I feel like, now that I'm a professor, it's like I do have this confidence to speak about African-American history outside of my specialty. And there was another thing that was added. Also, as historians, we often work individually, and there aren't really a ton of opportunities to work collaboratively. This really offered us a chance to do that, which again, I think is a really wonderful skill to have. And I really appreciate that collaborative experience, because again, you don't have that writing the dissertation or working on an article. So I think that was a really, really wonderful part about being part of this project.
I'm also a historian of the 20th century African-American experience. And when you learn about what it means to be a historian of the African-American history, you learn you're going to encounter silences in the archive. But when you do the 20th century, sometimes you don't encounter very many. But doing that work, especially on the first volume, thinking about and writing around the kind of archival silences, I do feel like it made me a stronger historian and gave me a new set of tools in my tool belt, and thinking about other tools the project gave me. Even now, I'm just a first semester kind of new professor at this new institution, but already thinking about building community-based history projects. So working with the local NAACP to kind of capture what the civil rights movement, the Black freedom movement looked like in this small town in Ohio, so that some of those same skills that were valuable for Scarlet and Black will be valuable moving forward.
I'm also a historian of the 20th century, so I definitely had a difficult time in the archives. Even, you know, issues that aren't as like profound as what my colleagues like said well-roundedly, but I just have such a appreciation for people who do this work. You know, little things like reading the handwriting of you know, 18th century writing that was a struggle that I had in the archive. But as far as student work goes, I can't really speak to the first volume as much, but undergraduate students did write the first or the second chapter of the first volume. But I was a TA for the Scarlet and Black seminar, which was a history majors seminar. So they went into the archives and gained a relationship with the archivists, and were in the archives 2 to 3 times a week doing research on Black students on campus. So, and they ended up, you know, writing a paper. And I think there was one student who had an especially good paper that his research was kind of used for the 3rd volume. He talked about Black fraternities and sororities on campus and the policing against them. So that's one thing that I took from the project that is really important. And I think, you know, just not getting the graduate students and not just getting the community at large involved, but like the undergraduate students, so they have more of a stake, feeling like this is a history of their school and proud to write about it. So,
All right, so let's go to some questions from the audience that is in the room with us.
Thank you for this really inspiring presentation. I wondered if you could share some reflections on making both university archives and courthouses more welcoming and accessible, especially to students of color. In the project we did here some years ago, that was definitely a challenge for all the good work and welcoming inclinations of archival staff. Something about the way the university archives looks signals, at least in those days, a sense of less welcoming. And going into the courthouses, certainly we had partners who were high school students who were in some cases adjudicated. And so going to the courthouse required a lot of complex negotiations. Our principal community partner, Mrs. Ebba-Jean Williams would actually organize little prayer sessions, both to sort of, as we got to the courthouse, to involve actually the security staff as well as the young people, to seek blessing for this work, which was both a way of sort of strengthening the young people that this was their courthouse, these were their records, but also to get the guards to stop interrogating them about whether or not they had upstanding summonses and things like that. So just any strategies for moving into the archives, something that is positive and not intimidating.
I think one thing that made the Rutgers project particularly successful with that is the archivists came on from the very beginning as stakeholders who were in conversation with the project from the very beginning and bought into its importance, help people find documents, set up kind of research layouts. So really working in partnership with the archivists. And I should say that I just took my class right to the archive, and I have a lot of seniors who are writing these independent studies about race and critical race theory, and they've never been to the archive of their own school. But just making it a space where you can come, you can sit down, asking the archivist to pull out documents and allowing them to touch and feel, and also telling them the history of the archive, right? That how did the space come to be? How might that history interject with histories that you're more familiar with or more you feel a stake in already, but bringing them into the space and working with the archivist to make it welcoming, right? So lining up chairs along the walls, putting out documents, telling people to walk around, ask questions, say what makes you happy, what makes you frustrated, picking up something and saying like, this is terrible, I don't like the language, like why is this like this? And giving students the kind of freedom to feel ownership of the space, I think is one way to make the space less intimidating.
Do we have any other questions from the in-person audience? Well, please speak into the mic because our Zoom audience will not hear the question if you don't.
So I wrote it down, if that's cool. So hi, I'm Chris, and I'm really interested in what y'all are doing in other universities, and so thank you for being here. I'm also an alumni of Emory. And this thought comes from a bit of theory that I picked up here at this institution, and it's a way of critiquing it and also asking for a better way of telling history. So Desserto talks about the problem of history is how historians work to historicize a phenomenon, where the attempt that they do is they make a cut in the present and create this thing called the past. But Soturo is helping us suggest that such cuts aren't so clean and that history can't be discursive because of its recursive nature. And the work that you all are doing here today suggests this. On the website at Rutgers, you talk about the history from slavery to Black Lives Matter. As historians today, you're speaking about what was talked about last night, a truth that can't be buried, one that can't be cut. My question is a large interest that probably can't be answered fully here, but it's about how universities, I'm thinking of Emory and Brown University and many others that claim these cuts. What suggestions would you have for these institutions to consider how these cuts are unfolding into the present?
I don't think I said this when I originally said what brought me to the project, but one of the big takeaways I think is important from the work happening at Rutgers and also all these universities are studying slavery is the universities, institutions need to think more critically about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. At Rutgers Newark, Conklin Hall takeover is the second founding, right? That's what people call it. And it's one of the more diverse college campuses. But if you talk to those students who make that diversity, they still feel marginalized, right? People of color are the majority and they still feel marginalized. So the university telling itself this story about itself, that this is our second founding. This is when we became our truest self, right? It's complicated because if you go back and you talk to the students who took the building over, they don't feel the demands were met. Even in that moment till the day, and it's a much more complicated narrative. They felt isolated and alienated by the campus. So they work with community partners, right? They're working with welfare moms and people who are fighting back against gentrification and those who are the people who they feel in community with. So I think complicating the stories universities tell themselves about who they are is key, right? And that can't just be about graduate students or professors, but it has to be about a number of stakeholders, whether that be alumni, community members, or undergrads. In particular, undergrads thinking about the geography of the institution. How can you have tours where people learn about a new narrative, about what it means to be a Rutgers person? What is our mascot? A Scarlet Knight. Okay.
Yeah, just to add to Dr. Adams's point, I think also when we're asking about the stories that we tell, it's the importance of keeping students at the center. So if you go back to how this project even started, it was because a group of students brought this to the attention of the administration. And even as we've gone through these different volumes, we always try to keep students at the center of the story that we tell, because as we know, it looks very different when you're looking at their experience than from the top down. But also to build on Dr. Adams's point is in each of our volumes, we actually have a chapter that's about New Brunswick, or in the third volume about Newark and Camden, so that we're conscious of the role of the university within a particular city and the really complicated relationship between these cities and the institutions, and how the institution not just impacts the people within it, but the people outside of it. So I think it's important to look beyond the boundaries of the actual institution.
So I think that we are almost at time. We're supposed to go to 10:45. So I will just take one more question from our online audience. It's a pretty straightforward question here. And John Benz asks, how much was this project faculty led? And without interested faculty, would this have happened? And he also asks, were faculty incentivized? Well, I would just, all of us were doctoral researchers, so I'm not gonna speak too much about the faculty perspective of the people who led the project, but what I can say is for our historians, Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Marisa Fuentes, they were very much interested. They are historians of slavery, and one of the incentives for them, I think I've heard Dr. White talk about this, was that she had to be sure from the administration that the history that we were going to bring forth was going to be not then swept under the rug, that we would have the kind of intellectual freedom to really go in and tell the true story, and that was an incentive for her, because she said, I'm not going to sign on to this and lead this project only to go then find all this evidence of Rutgers' connection to slaveholding, and then we want to kind of whitewash that, or not talk about some of the more shameful parts of this history. If we're going to do this, if you asking me to do it, you're going to get the real history. So be aware of that from the start. And I think that that was an important point that got her on board with that. So I think we are at time. So I'd like to thank our panelists today and thank our audience.